Hey everyone, tonight we'll delve into the terrifying, untold story of Medusa. We'll peel back the layers of a myth you thought you knew, revealing a truth far more disturbing and tragic than any tale of a snake-haired monster. You probably won't want to believe what you are about to hear because the truth is, Medusa was never a monster at all. Imagine you stand on the precipice of a forgotten world, the air thick with the scent of salt and stone, the roar of the Aegean Sea a distant thunder in your ears. But above you, the sky shifts from twilight to a deep, bruised purple, as if the heavens themselves are mourning a tragedy that is yet to unfold. A single, crystalline teardrop of light, the first star, pierces the velvet darkness, mirroring the tear that a young, hopeful girl named Medusa will soon shed. So, before the tension gets too high, take a moment to like the episode and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now close your eyes, imagine the ancient mountains, and let's unravel this epic tale together. The terrifying true story of Medusa's curse begins not with a monster, but with a child. A girl named Medusa, born not of a Gorgon lineage, but of two human parents on the sun-drenched shores of the Greek mainland. The whispers of her fate began the moment she took her first breath, an uncanny silence falling over the midwife's room as her mother gazed upon her newborn daughter's eyes. They were not the soft brown eyes of her mother, nor the kind blue of her father, but a strange shifting silver, like liquid moonlight. This detail, this bizarre, beautiful oddity, set her apart from birth. The local legends told of a great prophecy, whispered among the ancient olive groves, that a child with the eyes of the moon would either bring an age of unparalleled wisdom or an age of ultimate darkness. In her small, isolated village, she was seen as a miracle. Her parents, humble fishermen, saw only the beauty, choosing to believe in the wisdom, shielding her from the subtle fear that rippled through the community. But Medusa's childhood was far from ordinary. When she was just a small girl, she would wander down to the coast, not to play in the waves like the other children, but to listen. She claimed the sea would whisper secrets to her, secrets of sunken cities and forgotten gods. When she would return, she would draw pictures in the sand of magnificent temples, beings with wings and scales, and of constellations no one had ever seen. The other children would laugh, but her drawings were so detailed, so impossibly vivid, that the elders would exchange nervous glances. One day, a traveling merchant from a distant land saw her drawings and, with a gasp, recognized one of the temples. He claimed it was the Temple of Poseidon in a far-off city, a place she could not possibly have known about. This strange knowledge was just one of many quirks that set her apart. She never spoke of where the visions came from, only that they felt like echoes of a life she hadn't yet lived, or perhaps one she had already forgotten. The most disturbing of these visions came in the form of a recurring dream. She saw a goddess, radiant and terrible, with a shield so bright it burned her eyes, and a helmet shaped like a fearsome owl. The goddess would stand over her, not with anger, but with an immense, palpable sorrow, a sorrow so deep it would wake Medusa in a cold sweat. The dreams always ended the same way, with the goddess extending a hand and speaking a single word, a word Medusa could never remember once she woke. This strange detail, this forgotten word, became a source of obsession for her. She would spend hours trying to recall it, the sense of urgency growing with each passing year. You can't help but wonder, what would you do if a deity haunted your dreams, not with rage, but with a profound and overwhelming sadness? This recurring dream wasn't a warning, it was a promise, one she was fated to fulfill whether she wanted to or not. But the question that remained was, what was the source of these visions, and why were they tied so deeply to a goddess who appeared to be in mourning? As Medusa grew, the strange visions intensified. They were no longer confined to her dreams, but began to bleed into her waking life. She would be walking through the village market, and for a fleeting moment, the faces of the vendors would shimmer, replaced by the grim, weathered visages of ancient deities. The smell of fresh-baked bread would transform into the scent of burnt offerings on a forgotten altar. She would hear whispers on the wind, not of her name, but of a different name, a name that felt both intimately hers and entirely alien. Gorgon. This internal conflict, this duality of identity, began to take a toll. She felt like a stranger in her own body, a feeling that no one else in her small community could possibly understand. The other children who once simply laughed at her now began to avoid her. They sensed the strange aura that clung to her, the air of otherworldliness she couldn't shake. This isolation was compounded by a unique detail of her existence. Her hair? It was a cascade of a color so deep and vibrant, it was said to be the color of the midnight sea itself. But unlike her peers' hair, which was straight or wavy, hers seemed to have a life of its own. It would shift and writhe subtly in the light, as if each strand were a living thing. A traveling scholar once told her father that her hair resembled the bioluminescent algae found in the deepest trenches of the ocean, a phenomenon that was both beautiful and terrifying. This peculiar trait, combined with her silver eyes, made her an object of both fascination and suspicion. One local legend, a tale of a vengeful sea serpent, described its scales as having the same otherworldly shimmer as Medusa's hair, an unfortunate parallel that did nothing to quell the growing unease among the villagers. One evening, while standing on the cliffs overlooking the sea, a vision overwhelmed her. She saw not the familiar waves and setting sun, but a magnificent palace of white marble and gleaming gold, suspended in the clouds. This was Mount Olympus, the home of the gods, a place mortals only dared to imagine. She saw the gods and goddesses in their full glory, their forms radiating with unimaginable power. But this was no joyous vision. She saw them arguing, their voices a cacophony of thunder and lightning. She saw a young goddess, her face a mask of grief, clutching a shield and a helmet, her form identical to the one in Medusa's dreams. The goddess was arguing with Poseidon, the mighty ruler of the seas. Poseidon's anger was a storm, his form shifting, his trident shaking the very foundations of the sky. The argument was about Medusa herself, about her fate, about a promise made and broken long ago. Now the vision was so real, so vivid that when it ended, Medusa collapsed, gasping for breath. She had seen the raw power of the deities, their petty jealousies and earth-shattering disputes. But what truly terrified her was the realization that she was a pawn in their celestial game. She was a footnote in a larger, more ancient story, one she was only just beginning to understand. She had always felt a connection to the gods, but she had never comprehended the scale of their indifference, their willingness to sacrifice a mortal for their own gain. The whispers on the wind were no longer just echoes. They were commands, and she was an unwilling participant in a cosmic drama she had no hope of escaping. But the question that remained was, what had happened between Poseidon and the goddess of her dreams that tied Medusa so inextricably to their conflict? The prophetic whispers that had haunted Medusa since birth were no longer benign. They were growing into a physical, palpable threat. The visions of Olympus, once fleeting, now consumed her. She would lose time, her mind wandering through the halls of the gods, while her body remained rooted in the mortal world. This disassociation became so severe that she could no longer perform simple tasks without the risk of injury. One afternoon, while helping her father mend his fishing nets, a sudden vision of Poseidon's rage consumed her. She saw him striking the sea with his trident, his fury causing a tidal wave to crash against the distant shores. The vision was so vivid that she dropped the sharp awl she was using, the tool slicing a deep gash into her palm. The wound itself was not the most terrifying part. What truly frightened her was that, as the blood welled up, it did not look red. It looked like liquid silver, the same color as her eyes. This strange detail was a horrifying confirmation of her deepest fears. She was not fully mortal. Her blood, the very essence of her being, was tainted by something divine, or perhaps something monstrous. Her parents, who had always tried to shield her from the whispers of the village, could no longer deny the truth. The wound, which should have bled freely, barely stained the ground. It was a detail so bizarre, so alien, that her father, a man of simple faith, looked at her not with love, but with a dawning terror. A historical anecdote from ancient Greece tells of a similar phenomenon in the story of the hero Achilles, whose ichor, the ethereal blood of the gods, was said to be a golden color. Medusa's silver ichor was a darker, more unsettling shade, and it marked her as an anomaly. It's an unwelcome bridge between the divine and the mundane. The incident with her hand forced her parents to make a desperate choice. They could no longer protect her from the villagers, whose fear was turning to open hostility. It was whispered in the taverns and market stalls that she was a witch, or worse, a cursed abomination sent to bring ruin upon their community. The villagers began to leave offerings of salt and iron on her doorstep, ancient folk remedies meant to ward off evil spirits. They were no longer the simple, kind people who had once celebrated the girl with the silver eyes. They were a fearful, superstitious mob, driven by the unseen hand of a deity's silent influence. The divine conflict that had spilled into her dreams was now seeping into her reality, poisoning the very earth she stood upon. One morning, her father came to her with a map, a crude drawing on a piece of brittle parchment. He had found it among his father's old possessions, a hidden heirloom passed down through generations. The map showed a remote and secluded temple, dedicated to the goddess of her dreams. The temple was located on a small, isolated island, far from the mainland, a place where mortals rarely ventured. He told her that this was her only chance for sanctuary, a place where she might find an explanation for the visions and perhaps a cure for the curse that was slowly consuming her. He had a look in his eyes that was both loving and desperate, the kind of look a parent gives when they are forced to let go of their child to save their life. He couldn't go with her. The journey was too dangerous, and he knew his presence would only bring more scrutiny. But the question that remained was, why was this ancient map, this beacon of hope, hidden in her family's possession, as if her fate had been sealed long before she was born? The mortal realm offered no sanctuary. The fear and superstition of her village had metastasized into outright hostility. Medusa's journey was not a pilgrimage, but an escape. She carried only a small pouch of dried figs and a water skin, the map a fragile, constant reminder of her precarious fate. She traveled by night, her silver eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight, a beacon she tried desperately to conceal. The whispers of the villagers, now shouts of witch and demon, followed her like a physical presence. The forests she walked through seemed to hold their breath, the nocturnal creatures going silent as she passed. A subtle confirmation that something about her was deeply unnatural. The world itself seemed to recoil from her presence. During her solitary travels, she observed the world with a newfound, terrifying clarity. She noticed the small, peculiar details that most people overlooked. The way a spider, spinning its web, would meticulously avoid a certain patch of ground, as if a higher power had marked it as forbidden. Or the way a small, insignificant wildflower, the asphodel, seemed to grow in abundance only near ancient burial grounds, a chilling detail that, according to Greek folklore, was connected to the fields of the underworld. These small, bizarre observations compounded her sense of isolation and otherness. She was a being who saw the world not as it was, but as it truly was, a tapestry woven with threads of divinity and death, a reality too profound and frightening for mortals to comprehend. Her journey was a test of both body and spirit. She was no warrior, no hero. She was a girl who had been cast out. The elements were her constant companions. The biting wind, the relentless sun, the unforgiving rock under her feet. But it was not the physical hardship that truly wore her down. It was the crushing loneliness. She found herself whispering to the trees, to the streams, to anything that would listen. A desperate attempt to feel connected to something, anything. This psychological torment was a slow, deliberate form of torture, a prelude to the fate that awaited her. She felt the curse of her existence not as a sudden calamity, but as a slow, inexorable erosion of her humanity. She was a living monument to a forgotten conflict, a tragedy waiting to happen. One evening, exhausted and famished, she stumbled upon a small, isolated farmstead. The farmer, an elderly man with kind eyes and a weathered face, saw not a monster, but a starving girl. He took her in, offering her bread, cheese, and a place by his fire. For the first time since her visions began, she felt a flicker of hope. He told her stories of the old days, of a time when gods and mortals lived in harmony, before the great schisms and forgotten wars. He spoke of the gods with a kind of weary reverence, describing them not as all-powerful beings, but as a dysfunctional, powerful family with human flaws. It was an insight that gave her a new perspective. A small detail he mentioned was that the gods, for all their power, could not change a person's inherent nature, only their form. It was a cryptic observation that would later prove to be a terrifying truth. But the question that remained was, why had the gods allowed this farmer to live in peace, and what secret did his quiet life hold that might be relevant to her destiny? The sanctuary Medusa sought was a lie, a shocking betrayal delivered by the one person she had trusted. The kind old farmer, the man with the gentle hands and the weary reverence for the gods, was not a simple mortal. It was a creature of the sea, a minor water spirit who served Poseidon. Placed in that secluded location, specifically to watch for her. The bread and cheese, the stories of the old days, it had all been a performance, meticulously crafted illusion to lure her into a false sense of security. One evening, as she sat by the fire, a sense of profound unease washed over her. The sound of the wind outside was no longer a mournful whisper, but a deep, resonant hum, as if the very air was vibrating with divine power. The fire in the hearth, instead of flickering with orange and red flames, burned with an unnatural blue-green light, the color of the deep ocean. The farmer's face, once kind, began to contort, his skin shimmering like scales in the strange light. His eyes, no longer gentle, glowed with the cold, calculating fury of the sea god he served. He revealed his true form, a being of water and shadow, his voice a low, rumbling roar that echoed with the sound of crashing waves. He confessed that he had been sent to guide her to the very temple she sought, not as a place of refuge, but as a trap. Poseidon, in his jealousy and rage, had orchestrated this entire scenario, using her as a pawn in his long-standing feud with the goddess of her dreams. The old farmer's last act of kindness, a final, small act of defiance against his master, was a single, cryptic whisper. Beware the goddess who weeps, for her sorrow is a shield. This bizarre detail, this last shred of truth from a deceptive being, was all she had to cling to as the illusion of safety shattered around her. Medusa's world, which had already been teetering on the edge of chaos, collapsed entirely. She felt a profound and soul-crushing despair. Her parents had sent her into the wilderness to be caught, the map, an invitation to her doom. The farmer who had shown her kindness had been her captor all along. The very concept of trust, of innocence, was a cruel joke played by the gods. The psychological impact of this betrayal was devastating. She had been a girl looking for answers. Now she was a hunted creature, her fate not only predetermined, but also meticulously planned by beings who saw her as nothing more than a bargaining chip. The psychological intrigue of this moment is that Medusa did not feel anger first. She felt a crushing loneliness, a sense of being utterly abandoned by the world and its inhabitants, both mortal and divine. As the farmer's form dissolved back into a shimmering pool of water, he gave her a chilling final warning. The temple awaits. But so does she. The ominous phrasing was a stark reminder of the gravity of her situation. This was not a simple quest for a cure. It was a journey to her judgment. Her only choice was to press on, to face the very entities who had condemned her. Because turning back meant facing the angry mob of villagers and a life of constant fear. She had been robbed of her home, her family, and her sense of self, and now she had to face the very entity who was the source of all her suffering. The only thing she had left was a strange, hauntingly beautiful dream of a weeping goddess and a warning from a sea spirit that her sorrow was her protection. But the question that remained was, why was the goddess weeping, and what sorrow could be so great that it could be used as a shield? Medusa's terrifying dream of a goddess's shadow was no longer just a premonition. It was the next step on her inescapable journey. After the betrayal, she felt a strange, detached calm. There was no more hope to be crushed, no more trust to be broken. The path ahead toward the isolated island and the temple was now a clear, cold march toward her fate. She secured passage on a small fishing vessel. Its grizzled captain, a man who had seen too much of the CS fury to be surprised by a girl with silver eyes. He spoke of the island in hushed tones, referring to it not as a place of worship, but as the Isle of Whispers, a name derived from the strange, disembodied voices sailors claimed to hear on the wind as they sailed past. This small detail, this local legend of a place so ominous it earned a chilling nickname, only solidified Medusa's resolve. She was no longer a victim. She was a protagonist in a tragedy, and she would meet her end with her eyes wide open. As the boat approached the island, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy and still, the usual raucous cries of the seabirds replaced by an unnatural silence. The island itself was a jagged monument of black rock, its peaks shrouded in a perpetual swirling mist. It looked less like a place of worship and more like a tombstone in the middle of the sea. As she stepped onto the rocky shore, a new vision overwhelmed her. The island, she saw, was not just a piece of rock, but the fossilized remains of a primordial titan, a giant whose body had been petrified eons ago, his outstretched hand forming the cove where she had landed. This bizarre detail, this secret geological history of the island, was a testament to the scale of the ancient world and the forgotten beings that once inhabited it. It also explained the eerie silence and the feeling of immense, sleeping power that permeated the air. She was walking on the corpse of a giant, a detail only a demigod or a cursed being would ever notice. She began the long, arduous climb toward the temple, following a faint, almost invisible path that snaked up the mountain. With every step, the sense of her impending fate grew stronger. The whispers she had heard since childhood were now louder, more distinct. They spoke of a great war, not of mortals, but of the gods themselves. They spoke of a goddess who had defied the will of her father, a defiance that had led to a terrible price. And they spoke of Medusa's role in this, not as a punishment for a sin she committed, but as an object lesson, a symbol of a goddess's power and her father's brutal authority. The narrative of her curse, the story everyone thought they knew, was a carefully constructed lie designed to obscure the true conflict, the real betrayal that had occurred between two celestial beings. As she neared the temple's entrance, the air grew thick with the scent of ozone and the strange metallic smell of fresh blood. The entrance was a massive archway carved directly into the black rock, and standing before it was the goddess from her dreams. But she was not the radiant, terrible figure Medusa had envisioned. She was a being of profound sadness, her face etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to crack the very stone around her. Her eyes, instead of burning with divine fury, were clouded with tears. She clutched her shield not as a weapon, but as a comfort, a polished mirror reflecting the face of the young mortal before her. The goddess's name was Athena. But the question that remained was, what had Athena done to warrant this profound, unending sorrow? And why was she waiting for Medusa with such an immense sadness? The confrontation with the goddess herself was not the battle Medusa had braced for, but a quiet, devastating conversation. Athena, goddess of wisdom, war, and justice, did not stand in front of her as a furious deity, but as a being burdened by an impossible weight. Her armor, once shining, was dulled, and her shield, which Medusa had seen as a weapon, was held protectively, almost remorsefully, in front of her. The temple's antechamber was silent, save for the soft echo of a single drop of water falling from the ceiling, a sound that amplified the tension in the air. Athena gestured for Medusa to enter, her movement not a command, but an invitation. Inside the temple, the air was heavy with the scent of old stone and unfulfilled promises. Frescoes on the walls depicted not battles or triumphs, but quiet, tragic scenes, a father turning his back on his daughter, a sister weeping over a forgotten vow. The art told a different story of Olympus, one of familial conflict and emotional wounds. One fresco in particular showed the god Poseidon, but not in his usual guise of a powerful sea lord. Here he was depicted as a young, impetuous god, arguing with an equally youthful Athena, their quarrel seemingly over a small, insignificant object held in the hand of a third, unidentifiable figure. This strange detail hinted at a pre-existing conflict between them, a history of animosity that had nothing to do with Medusa. It was a confirmation that she was not the cause of their rivalry, but its unfortunate consequence. Athena began to speak, her voice a low, melodic thrum that seemed to vibrate through the very bedrock of the island. She told Medusa a story, not of a mortal's pride, but of a god's broken promise. She revealed that Medusa was not just a mortal girl, but a distant descendant of a primordial sea goddess, a forgotten deity whose lineage had long been absorbed by humanity. This lineage was why Medusa had the silver eyes, the preternatural hair, and the ability to hear the whispers of the ocean. Poseidon had promised Medusa's ancestor a place of honor, truce between the domains of sea and land, but had instead used her for his own gain in a forgotten conflict with Athena. The goddess explained that Zeus, in his infinite and often cruel wisdom, had decided to use Medusa as a living lesson, a tool to teach Athena a lesson about pride and defiance. He would not punish his daughter directly, but would instead destroy the one thing she cared about most in the mortal realm. The wisdom and beauty of Medusa, the last living link to a promise that should have been kept. This was a profoundly chilling revelation. The curse was not a punishment for a crime Medusa committed. It was a punishment for Athena. The goddess, in a rare moment of vulnerability, admitted that she had watched over Medusa, her dreams a form of communication, a desperate attempt to warn her of the coming tragedy. She had tried to bargain with Zeus, but his judgment was absolute. She could not stop the curse, but she could be present for it. To witness the cruel injustice, and perhaps to offer a small act of mercy. A historical account of Greek myths reveals that Athena, for all her wisdom, had a deep-seated pride and a rivalry with Poseidon. That had been a running theme in their histories from the naming of Athens to countless lesser-known disputes. But the question that remained was, what kind of curse would Zeus inflict on a mortal to punish a goddess? And what was the true, terrifying nature of the power Medusa was about to receive? The cruel terms of the unthinkable curse were laid bare, not in a thunderous proclamation, but in a series of chilling, quiet directives from Athena. She explained that the curse was a perversion of Medusa's very nature, a cruel twist of the divine energy that flowed through her veins. It was not designed to kill her, but to transform her into a weapon. Her beauty, which had been a source of suspicion and a tool in the gods' game, would be replaced by a terrifying ugliness. Her preternatural silver eyes, which once held a nascent wisdom, would become instruments of petrification. This was the true horror of the curse. It was a forced mutation of her most unique and beautiful features into something monstrous. Athena explained that the curse would function as a reverse echo of her lineage. Where her ancestor had been able to bestow life on the sea, Medusa would now be a purveyor of stillness and death. The curse was designed to make her a pariah, a living monument to Zeus's fury, a fate far worse than death. The goddess's sorrow was now comprehensible. She wasn't just a sympathetic bystander. She was the unwilling orchestrator of this brutal transformation. She was the one who, by the will of her father, had to deliver the very thing she had tried to prevent. The emotional weight of this revelation was a psychological blow far more potent than any physical wound. The goddess, in a voice heavy with grief, detailed the final, most terrifying part of the curse. Medusa would not only transform physically, but her mind would also be twisted, her memory slowly erased, replaced with a single, overriding instinct, to protect the very temple she had sought refuge in. She would become the eternal guardian of this place, a sentinel of stone, her consciousness trapped within a monstrous body. This mental erosion was the ultimate cruelty, the final act of stripping her of her humanity. She would be an immortal being, but without the memories or personality that made her Medusa. This detail, this psychological torture, was a far more profound curse than mere physical transformation. A bizarre historical fact from some ancient texts suggests that certain Greek rituals involved a form of induced memory loss to prepare acolytes for a spiritual rebirth. A strange parallel to what was happening to Medusa. But in this case, it was a forced, violent process, not a willing one. Medusa, for her part, listened with a strange calm. The revelation of the curse, the details of her impending dehumanization, did not break her. Instead, it hardened her resolve. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a woman who had been betrayed by gods and mortals alike, and if her only purpose was to be a monster, then she would be the most terrifying monster the world had ever known. But the question that remained was, if her mind was to be erased, what was the last thing she would choose to remember, and would she have the strength to hold on to it? The agonizing transformation began. It was not a sudden, violent eruption of power, but a slow, excruciating metamorphosis that started from the inside out. The first change was subtle, a feeling of coldness spreading from her hands to her feet, as if her blood was turning to stone. Medusa's vision began to blur, her silver eyes shimmering with an unnatural light that seemed to pulse with a low, menacing energy. The world around her, once a canvas of vibrant color, was slowly fading into a monochrome of grays and blacks. The warm tones of the temple's stone walls and the soft light from the entrance were all leaching away, replaced by a cold, lifeless palette. She was seeing the world as her future victims would, a world stripped of life and color. This bizarre psychological phenomenon was a terrifying precursor, a window into her new reality. She was becoming her own curse, a mirror reflecting a gray and joyless world. Next, the physical changes accelerated. A deep, agonizing ache started in her spine, a sensation of bones shifting and fusing. Her skin, once soft and warm, began to harden, becoming leathery and cold to the touch. But the most terrifying change was the one that began on her head. The preternatural, writhing hair that had been the subject of so much suspicion began to move on its own, its movements no longer subtle, but serpentine. Each strand twisted and thickened, transforming into a living, hissing serpent. The process was agonizing, each scale forming, each tongue flicking with a mind of its own. It was a macabre, broad biological horror, a forced and violent evolution. She could hear the faint, high-pitched hissing, a sound that was both outside of her and somehow, inside of her head, a chorus of tiny, venomous voices. The transformation was meticulously cruel. As her human form was stripped away, so too were her memories. The details of her life, the scent of her mother's bread, the feel of her father's hand. The old farmer's betraying smile began to fade, like ink washed away by a relentless tide. Her mind, once a repository of her humanity, was slowly being replaced by the single, overriding directive that Athena had mentioned: protect the temple. The psychological horror of this moment was the most profound part of the curse. She was not only losing her body but her very self. She was a ghost trapped in a monstrous shell, a soul being consumed by a single, terrifying purpose. A strange historical detail related to this kind of psychological trauma can be found in a few ancient cultures, where priests and priestesses would undergo a symbolic death and rebirth, often involving sensory deprivation and fasting, to strip them of their mortal identity and prepare them for their new, divine one. But for Medusa, this was a forced violation, a brutal stripping of her humanity. She was a living sacrifice, not for the benefit of humanity, but for the punishment of a goddess. The transformation was a silent, internal scream, a testament to the god's capacity for cruelty. But the question that remained was, amidst this psychological and physical annihilation, what one memory would she be able to cling to? A single ember of her former self that might survive the coming darkness. The physical changes mirrored the psychological torment, a terrifying synergy of external monstrousness and internal annihilation. As the last vestiges of her human form faded, Medusa's mind became a fractured mosaic of fleeting images and sensations. The world around her, once a tapestry of life and light, was now a colorless tableau, her new senses tuned only to the movements of living things. The weight of her new body was a constant, crushing presence, a mixture of petrified flesh and living scales. Her hair, now a nest of hissing serpents, constantly writhed and flicked, a maddening, living crown that communicated with her in a series of cryptic, instinctual whispers. They were no longer her thoughts, but a collective consciousness of reptiles. Their hunger and coldness, her new reality. The psychological torment was profound. She would catch glimpses of her reflection in the polished surface of a discarded shield. And for a fleeting second, she would see the old Hertha girl with the luminous silver eyes and the cascade of midnight hair. But the image would quickly distort, the face of the girl replaced by a horrifying visage of scaly skin, inhuman eyes, and the writhing mass of vipers. This bizarre detail, this recurring phantom image of her former self, was a cruel, psychological torture designed to remind her of what she had lost. She was trapped between two realities, the memory of her humanity and the crushing reality of her new, monstrous existence. The temple, once a place of refuge, had become her prison. Her consciousness was slowly being absorbed by the rock, her mind melding with the very earth she stood upon. She felt the vibrations of the island, the tectonic shifts deep below the surface, the subtle decay of a forgotten titan. She was becoming a part of the earth, an immortal living statue. This psychological fusion with her environment was the final stage of the curse, the culmination of her forced transformation. She was no longer Medusa. She was the guardian, the silent sentinel of the island, a living monument to a forgotten war between gods. A strange historical parallel can be drawn to the psychological states of people who are believed to be spiritually possessed in some ancient cultures. They are said to lose their identity and take on the characteristics of the inhabiting spirit, a phenomenon that mirrors Medusa's forced transformation from a human girl into a living, immortal weapon. But in Medusa's case, the possession was not by a spirit, but by a curse, a malevolent will of the gods. Her very being was now a weapon, her gaze a silent, instant form of death. She was a living instrument of Zeus's wrath, a testament to the gods' willingness to corrupt and destroy for their own petty squabbles. But amidst the swirling chaos of her mind, a single fleeting memory remained. A single ember of her former self that the curse had failed to extinguish. It was the memory of a boy, a young man she had met on the shore during her childhood, a boy with kind eyes and a curious mind. He had not feared her strange hair or her silver eyes. He had simply sat beside her and listened as she told him of her dreams. It was a memory of pure, unadulterated kindness, a kindness she had not experienced since. But the question that remained was, why had this specific memory of a lost boy survived the curse, and what was his true connection to her fate? An echo of a forgotten prophecy resurfaced, not as a whisper in the wind, but as a faint, distant signal in the chaos of Medusa's mind. Amidst the hissing of the vipers and the cold weight of her new body, a single phrase from a long-lost oracle came to her. The Oracle of Delphi, in one of its rarely recorded moments of clarity, had once spoken of the Gorgon born of man, and of the hero whose mirror will break a god's pride. This strange detail, this prophecy that was more of a riddle, was a jarring intrusion into her mind, a piece of old information that the curse had failed to fully erase. It was a terrifying confirmation that her fate was not a recent tragedy, but an event that had been foreseen, a play that had been written long before she was born. The prophecy hinted at a truth far more complex than a simple hero's quest. It spoke of a mirror, not a weapon, and of a god's pride, not a monster's death. This psychological intrigue suggested that the hero who would eventually come for her would not be a slayer, but a mirror, reflection of the god's cruelty. The prophecy didn't foretell her death, but her liberation. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible piece of information that gave her a new, terrifying perspective. Her destiny was not to be a monster, but to be a catalyst for a greater change, a harbinger of a new age. The curse had intended to make her a mindless guardian, but this ancient knowledge, this ghost from the past, was giving her a new, terrifying purpose. As she struggled to hold on to this new information, she felt a profound sense of loneliness. She was a being of stone and snakes, her only companions the silent statues of those who had foolishly wandered into her temple. But she wasn't alone. She was the last link in a chain of divine and human beings, a living echo of a forgotten conflict. The memory of the boy, the one who had listened to her dreams, surfaced once more, and with it came a name. Perseus. A name that, in her human life, meant nothing. And now it resonated with the cold finality of the prophecy. He was the hero, the one destined to hold the mirror, the one whose actions would break a god's pride. A bizarre historical fact from some lesser-known mythological texts is that the hero Perseus was not originally from the mainstream Greek narrative. He was a character from a more obscure ancient legend. A hero whose story had been later co-opted and sanitized to fit the grand narrative of the gods. In the original legend, he was not just a hero, but a man of profound sorrow, a detail that the mainstream myths often overlooked. His sorrow was said to be a result of his own curse, a curse of a different kind that was a mirror to her own. But the question that remained was, what was Perseus's curse, and how would it connect him to her tragic fate? The first victim was a symbol of lost innocence, not a warrior or a fool, but a young doe. The creature had wandered into the temple, seeking shelter from a sudden, unexpected downpour. Medusa, her consciousness now a blurred line between human memory and monstrous instinct, felt the familiar surge of power as her eyes fixed on the animal. The world, already a tapestry of grays and blacks, was suddenly washed with a brilliant, blinding white. The doe, in a moment of terror, froze. And then, with a soft grinding sound, it turned to stone, its eyes wide with a final, uncomprehending fear. The psychological horror of this moment was not the act itself, but the dawning realization of what she had become. She was no longer just the victim of a curse. She was now its instrument. The sight of the petrified doe was a jarring, horrifying intrusion into the fog of her mind. For a fleeting second, the old Medusa, the girl who had loved the feel of warm sun on her skin, resurfaced. She saw the statue not as a victory, but as a tragedy. She was a weapon of mass destruction, a living artifact of her own suffering. This bizarre, lucid moment was a profound psychological blow. The curse had failed to fully erase her empathy. She was a monster who could still feel sorrow, a killer who mourned her victims. She was a living paradox, a cruel joke played by the gods. A strange historical detail from ancient Greek rituals for the hunt involved the sacrifice of a doe to the goddess Artemis. A ritual meant to purify the hunter of the violence he was about to commit. Medusa's involuntary petrification of the doe was a perversion of this ritual, a profane act that turned a symbol of a goddess's purity into a monument of a hero's impending violent act. It was a chilling detail, a twisted echo of the very myths that were being created around her. As the realization of her monstrousness solidified, a new, more dangerous aspect of the curse was revealed. Her power was not just for petrifying. The statue of the doe, now a silent, beautiful monument to her cruelty, was emanating a strange, ethereal energy. It was a faint, high-pitched hum, a sound that she felt in her very bones. She understood with a chilling clarity that this energy was a beacon, a signal to the hero from the prophecy. Her first act of unintended violence was not just a tragic accident. It was a cosmic bell, ringing out into the world, announcing her new monstrous existence. The curse had not just turned her into a monster. It had turned her into a lure, a living trap for the hero of the prophecy. But the question that remained was, what was the true nature of this beacon, and how was it connected to the hero's destiny? Medusa's desperate flight to the world's edge was less a choice and more a primal, overwhelming compulsion. The horror of what she had done to the doe, combined with the sickening realization that her existence was now a homing beacon, was a torment she could no longer bear. She had to flee, not just from the inevitable hero, but from the horrifying monument she was becoming. She was no longer a being of free will. Her consciousness was a constant battle between her last, clinging human memory and the all-consuming directive to stand guard. The only way to find even a flicker of peace was to run, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the cursed temple. Her flight was a grotesque parody of her earlier escape. She no longer walked, she slithered, her lower body a thick serpentine coil, a final, grotesque mockery of her human form. The hissing of her hair was a constant, maddening chorus. She moved with a speed and grace she had never possessed as a human, her new body perfectly adapted to the craggy, unforgiving terrain of the island. She was a biological marvel, a living testament to the gods' dark genius. She found herself moving toward the most desolate, uninhabitable part of the island, a place where the cliffs fell into the sea in a chaotic tumble of black rock. She had to find a place where no mortal would ever dare to venture, a place where she could finally be alone with her torment. As she moved, she encountered another strange phenomenon: the statues of her past victims. The poor sailors and curious villagers who had found their way to the temple were not just silent stone, they were connected to her, a bizarre psychic link that hummed with a low, mournful energy. She could feel their last moments, the fear, the surprise, the dawning horror, a shared consciousness of suffering that bound them all together. This strange detail, this macabre spiritual connection, was a form of psychological torture designed to ensure she would never forget the lives she had stolen. The curse wasn't just a physical transformation. It was a punishment that bound her to the souls of her victims, a living hell of eternal empathy. A bizarre historical fact from some ancient Greek seafarers' lore speaks of a remote island where sailors would often hear the whispers of ghosts trapped in stone. A local legend that now, in this moment, felt horrifyingly real. It was believed that the island was cursed by a vengeful god, but the truth was far more tragic. The island was Medusa, and the whispers were the echoes of her sorrow and the suffering of her victims. This local legend, once just a cautionary tale for sailors, was a haunting, distorted echo of her reality. She was a living myth, a story whose true, terrifying beginning had been deliberately erased. But the question that remained was, what would happen when her flight came to an end, and what awaited her at the world's edge? A tragic reunion with a past love was the final devastating act in Medusa's descent. At the very edge of the world, on a desolate cliff face overlooking the churning sea, she found him. The boy from her memory, the one with the kind eyes and curious mind, was not a ghost, but a man, his face a little older, a little wearier. His name was Perseus. He stood on the precipice, not with a weapon drawn, but with a look of profound sorrow on his face. He had followed the faint, ethereal hum emanating from her, the very beacon she had tried to escape. He had not come to kill a monster. He had come to find the girl he remembered, the girl with the strange, luminous eyes. He told her a story that filled the last remaining voids in her fragmented mind. He was not a hero by choice. He was the son of a king who, in a twisted act of love, did secretly sired him with a sea nymph, a detail that had been scrubbed from most heroic tales. This bizarre detail, this forgotten lineage, explained his deep connection to her in the sea. He had been cursed by his mother's father, a minor sea deity, to forever feel the weight of all who died at sea, a curse of infinite sorrow. He was a hero whose strength came not from his muscles, but from his profound capacity for grief, a psychological torment that mirrored her own. His quest was not for fame or glory, but for a cure to his own curse, a cure he had been told could only be found by confronting the Gorgon. As they stood on the cliff, the sound of the crashing waves a mournful soundtrack to their reunion, Perseus reached out to her, his hand trembling. He did not fear the serpents or the petrifying gaze. He saw only the girl he had once known. In his eyes, she saw not the monster she had become, but the humanity she had lost. The recognition was a searing pain, a psychological agony far worse than the transformation itself. For a fleeting moment, she was Medusa again, a girl who loved and feared and hoped. He was a living mirror of her past, a reminder of a life she could no longer have. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked in the Medusa myth is that Perseus' quest was not an act of pure heroism, but a self-serving mission to prove his worth to a king who wished to be rid of him. The myth paints a picture of a brave hero on a noble quest, but the truth was far more cynical. He was a pawn, just as Medusa was, in a larger game of divine and mortal intrigue. His sorrow, his true motive, had been a conveniently forgotten detail, a truth that would have humanized the hero too much for the epic myths. But the question that remained was, if Perseus's quest was for a cure to his own curse, what was the price, and would he be willing to pay it? A deceptive promise of a cure hung in the air, a final, agonizing thread of hope for both Medusa and Perseus. He revealed the true nature of his quest. He had been told by a sea oracle that the only way to lift his curse of sorrow was to confront the Gorgon. The oracle's cryptic message was not to kill her, but to understand her. He believed that by facing her, by looking at her through a mirrored surface, he would gain insight into his own suffering and perhaps, by a twist of fate, free himself from his own torment. He had been given a shield by the god Hermes, a shield of polished bronze, and told that it would reflect not just the world, but the very truth of a person's soul. This bizarre detail, this unique property of the shield, was the cornerstone of his belief. He had not come with a sword to slay her, but with a mirror to understand her. This was a psychological masterpiece of manipulation on the part of the gods. They had told two cursed individuals that their salvation lay in a confrontation that was designed not to save them, but to seal their fates. Medusa's curse had turned her into a beacon for him, and his curse had compelled him to seek her out. They were both pawns in a divine game of psychological warfare, their destinies intertwined by a cruel cosmic joke. The so-called cure was a lie, a carefully constructed illusion meant to ensure that the hero would face the monster, fulfilling the prophecy in the most tragic way possible. Perseus, in his naivete, believed in the oracle's promise. He believed that by looking into the mirrored shield, he would not see a monster, but the girl he remembered, and in her reflection, he would find a key to his own salvation. This belief, this desperate hope, was a powerful psychological force. It was the only thing that had driven him to this desolate island. The only thing that had allowed him to overcome his own profound sorrow and face the terrifying legend he had been told about. A mainstream historical fact often glossed over is the role of the gods in manipulating human destinies. While heroes were often lauded for their bravery and cunning, it was the gods who truly orchestrated the events, planting false promises and half-truths in their minds to achieve their own, often petty ends. The heroes were not the protagonists of their own stories, were actors in a play written and directed by the deities. This reality, this brutal truth of divine indifferences, the true tragedy of Greek mythology. But the question that remained was, what would Perseus truly see in the reflection, and would the truth be too terrible to bear? The hero's origin and his hidden motive were far more complex and tragic than the myths ever allowed. Perseus, the son of the sea nymph Danae and the mortal king Acrisius, was not just a hero of noble lineage. His birth was a political maneuver, a desperate attempt by his father to secure an alliance with the sea kingdom. But the sea nymph's father, a minor deity, was furious at the union, and in a fit of rage he cursed Perseus to forever feel the sorrows of the ocean, the silent deaths of sailors, the lonely whispers of the deep, the slow decay of forgotten ships. This bizarre psychological curse was a profound and constant source of grief, a torment that made him an outcast in a world that prized strength and cheer. He was a hero in a constant state of mourning. His motive for seeking Medusa was not for glory or to fulfill a prophecy, but a desperate, selfish act for a cure. He had been told that Medusa was not just a monster but a being who, by a twist of her curse, was a mirror of all suffering. The oracle had told him that by looking into her soul through a reflective shield, he could see his own suffering externalized, and in that act of confrontation, he might be able to sever his connection to the sea's grief. This hidden agenda, this personal, deeply human reason for a supposedly epic quest, was the true driver of his journey. It was a detail that was later scrubbed from the heroic narratives. A truth that would have made him too relatable, too flawed, and not the perfect hero the myths demanded. The shield he carried, a gift from Hermes, was not a simple tool of battle. Its polished bronze surface was imbued with a strange, divine property. It did not just reflect light, but the very essence of a person's soul. This unique detail was meant to be the key to his cure. By looking into the shield while confronting Medusa, he was meant to see not a Gorgon, but the suffering that had transformed her, and in her reflection, see a mirror of his own pain. This was a psychological battle, not a physical one. His weapon was not a sword, but a mirror, and his strength was not in his arm, but in his capacity for empathy. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is the role of Hermes, the messenger god, in the Perseus myth. While he is often seen as a benevolent helper, his true nature was far more complex. He was a trickster, a master of deception who enjoyed manipulating mortals for his own amusement and the entertainment of the other gods. His gift to Perseus was a cruel joke, a tool designed to lead both the hero and Medusa to their tragic, predetermined end. The psychological intrigue of this moment is that Medusa's curse and Perseus's quest were not just two separate events, but a single, interconnected tragedy orchestrated by the gods. But the question that remained was, would Medusa understand the true nature of his quest? And what would she do when she saw her reflection in his shield? A dark secret about Perseus's shield was slowly, tragically revealed. As he held it up, preparing to face her, Medusa did not see a polished bronze surface, but a swirling, chaotic vortex of images. It was not just a mirror, it was a window into the past, a twisted reflection of her own memories. The shield showed her the day of her birth, her parents' faces twisted with both love and fear. It showed her the visions of Olympus, the rage of Poseidon, the sorrow of Athena. But these were not just her memories. They were Perseus's too. He was not just seeing her soul. He was seeing into her, and in doing so, he was allowing her to see into his. The shield was a two-way mirror, a horrifying tool of empathy that was meant to cure him by breaking her. The shield revealed the true nature of his curse. He was not just feeling the grief of the sea. He was the keeper of the sea's darkest secrets. He saw the sunken ships, the forgotten cities, the skeletons of ancient sailors. Their final moments of terror and despair a constant, deafening echo in his mind. He was a living archive of the ocean's tragedies, and his mind was a constant torrent of suffering. This bizarre psychic connection was a form of psychological torture that made him the perfect counterpart to Medusa. A monster of the mind to her monster of the body. He was the shadow of her light, the silent suffering to her visible torment. The shield was not just a tool, it was a weapon of shared trauma, a cruel joke played by Hermes to ensure that both of them would suffer in a way that would entertain the gods. A bizarre detail from some obscure ancient texts is the concept of accursed empathy, a state where a person is so connected to the suffering of others that they become unable to function. This psychological state, a form of divine madness, was a terrifying reality for Perseus. He was a hero who could not act, a man who could not live, because he was too busy drowning in the sorrows of a world he was meant to save. His quest for a cure was not just for his own sake, but for the sake of the world. He was a walking tragedy, a living testament to the gods' indifference to human suffering. The psychological intrigue of this moment was that Medusa saw not a hero, but a broken man, a boy she had once known, now consumed by a sorrow that mirrored her own. She saw his pain, his desperation, his misplaced hope. The curse that had turned her into a monster had also given her a new, terrible empathy. She could feel his sorrow as if it were her own, a shared burden of divine cruelty. She was a monster, but she was a monster who could still feel, and her newfound empathy was a new kind of hell. But the question that remained was, what would happen when the mirror reflected a truth too terrible to bear, and who would be the first to break? The god's secret agenda was exposed, a horrifying truth that was not whispered, but screamed through the shared psychic link of the shield. As Medusa and Perseus's minds connected, they saw the full, terrible picture. The curse was not about them. It was a long-simmering power struggle between the gods themselves. Zeus, in his infinite paranoia, had grown wary of the ever-growing influence of both Athena and Poseidon. The naming of Athens, the constant battles for mortal devotion, and the endless squabbles over dominion had made him realize that their combined power was a potential threat to his absolute rule. He could not punish them directly without causing a catastrophic war. Instead, he chose to attack their mortal connections, their proxies on Earth. He cursed Medusa to punish Athena, twisting her wisdom and beauty into a grotesque mockery. And he manipulated Perseus, a descendant of a sea nymph, into becoming the one to confront her, a living embodiment of Poseidon's suffering. The plan was a cruel and brilliant piece of divine theater. By forcing a hero connected to Poseidon to slay a monster born of a curse from Athena, he would achieve two goals. He would force Athena to live with the knowledge that she had indirectly caused Medusa Estimai as a constant reminder of her helplessness, and he would show Poseidon that his influence over the mortal world was a weakness, not a strength. He was using their pain, their love, and their sorrow as a weapon against his own children. This psychological warfare was the true nature of the gods' existence. They were not just benevolent beings or vengeful tyrants. They were master strategists, playing a cosmic game of chess with the lives of mortals. A historical fact often overlooked is the sheer number of minor deities and mortals who were caught in the crossfire of these Olympian power struggles. Their stories were either forgotten or rewritten to fit the grand narrative of the victorious gods. Medusa and Perseus were not unique. They were just two of many pawns in a long, brutal game. The bizarre detail of this revelation was that a god's pride could not be broken by force, but by a forced act of suffering. The curse was designed to make Athena watch as a symbol of her domain wisdom, and beauty was corrupted and destroyed by her own father's will, and Perseus's role was to be a living, breathing testament to Poseidon's weakness. A hero whose very existence was a painful reminder that the sea god's power was a fragile human thing. The shield was not just a mirror, it was a truth serum, a final, brutal dose of reality administered by Hermes, the ultimate trickster. It was a final lesson for both Medusa and Perseus. The gods did not care about them, only cared about their own power. But the question that remained was, what would Perseus do now that he knew the truth, and would he still be able to go through with his cruel and self-serving quest? The role of a forgotten oracle was uncovered, a final, crucial piece of information that solidified Medusa's understanding of her own tragic purpose. As the shared consciousness of the shield revealed the god's true agenda, a new distant memory resurfaced in Medusa's mind. It was not a memory of her own, but an echo of a forgotten prophecy, a whisper from the past that had been buried by time and divine interference. The prophecy belonged to an ancient, unnamed oracle, a seer whose prophecies were so true and so damning that Zeus had her silenced and her words erased from the annals of history. This bizarre detail, the existence of a forgotten oracle, whose truths were too dangerous for the gods, was a chilling confirmation of the scale of the Olympian conspiracy. This oracle had foretold of a great hero who would not save the world by force, but by a sacrifice so profound it would change the very nature of heroism. She had spoken of a hero who would carry the head of a Gorgon, not as a trophy, but as a key. This was the truth that the mainstream myths had deliberately obscured. The hero's quest was not to slay a monster, but to take her head, a symbol of her humanity and her suffering, and use it as a weapon against the very gods who had cursed her. The Gorgon's head was not a symbol of evil, but a tool of divine justice, a physical manifestation of a god's cruelty that could be used against them. The psychological intrigue of this moment was the dawning realization of her true purpose. She was not a monster to be killed, but a living weapon to be wielded. The curse had not just turned her into a Gorgon. It had turned her into a cosmic key, a living tool that could break a god's pride and challenge their very authority. This terrifying purpose was the only thing that had survived the curse's mental erosion. The memory of the oracle's prophecy was a powerful driving force, a new consciousness that was stronger than the curse itself. She was no longer just the guardian of the temple. She was the living embodiment of a truth too dangerous for the gods to let exist. A quirky detail from some obscure historical texts suggests that the word Gorgon was not originally a name, but a title given to the most powerful and cursed of beings, who were destined to become weapons of divine punishment. This etymological detail was a powerful psychological confirmation of Medusa's new reality. She was not a unique monster. She was a type of weapon, a divine instrument of a god's cruelty. This was her legacy, her true purpose, a truth that had been hidden from her for centuries. But the question that remained was, would Perseus understand this new purpose, and would he be willing to wield her as a weapon against the gods? The final confrontation was not on a battlefield, but in a secret, forgotten temple, a place that existed outside of time and space. As Perseus raised the mirrored shield, Medusa felt a final surge of power, a conscious decision to embrace her fate. She did not avert her gaze, but looked directly into the shield, a final, defiant act of will. In the polished bronze, she did not see the terrifying face of the Gorgon. She saw herself, the girl with the silver eyes, the child who had wandered the shores listening to the sea's secrets. She saw the truth of her existence, not as a monster, but as a victim, a vessel for a divine curse. She saw the boy she had once known, now a man burdened by an ocean of sorrow. And in that moment of shared empathy, she made her choice. She held her breath, not in fear, but in anticipation of her release. Perseus, for his part, did not see a monster in the shield. He saw the girl he remembered, her eyes no longer silver, but filled with a profound and terrible sadness that mirrored his own. He saw the truth of her suffering, the reality of the god's cruelty. The shield was not just a tool, it was a psychological weapon, a window into a shared reality of pain. He did not see a monster to be slain, but a fellow victim to be released. His hand trembled, not with fear, but with a deep, crushing sorrow. He was not a hero on a glorious quest. He was a man forced to kill the one person who truly understood his own suffering. A bizarre detail, often overlooked in the myth, is the sound of the killing blow. It was not a triumphant roar, but a silent, sorrowful whisper. The clatter of the sword was a hollow, empty sound, a testament to the fact that this was not a victory, but a tragedy. The act was quick, merciful, and devoid of any glory. There was no thunder from the heavens, no applause from the gods. There was only the sound of a man's silent tears, a sound that, according to some ancient texts, was a sound that the gods could not bear. A historical fact often glossed over is the nature of the temples of the minor deities, which were often hidden in remote, forgotten places. Their locations known only to a select few. The temple where Medusa and Perseus met was one such place. A sanctuary that had been deliberately erased from history, its purpose now a cruel cosmic joke. It was the perfect stage for a final, tragic act. A place where a hero's glory and a monster as death would be forever shrouded in sorrow and silence. But the question that remained was, what would become of Medusa's head? And would it truly be a key to a new destiny? The shocking truth behind Medusa's curse was revealed not in a moment of triumph, but in the quiet aftermath of her death. As Perseus held her severed head, it did not turn to stone, nor did it hiss with malevolent power. Instead, it wept. From her eyes, no longer silver, but a deep, bruised purple, fell the streams of liquid sorrow. The tears were not of a monster, but of a woman who had been a victim of a cruel, divine game. These tears, as they hit the ground, did not turn to dust or fade away. Instead, they transformed into a beautiful crimson flower, a bizarre detail that would later be known as the Gorgon's tear. A flower that was said to symbolize a curse turned into beauty, a symbol of hope born from sorrow. But the most shocking truth of all was that Medusa's curse had not just turned her into a monster. It had also, by a twist of divine irony, turned her into a powerful living artifact. Her blood, as it spilled onto the ground, did not petrify the earth, but imbued it with a strange, life-giving energy. From her neck, not a geyser of blood, but two small, perfect beings emerged. The first was Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword, and the second was Pegasus, a beautiful winged horse. These two beings, one a warrior and the other a messenger, were not born of a monstrous union, but of a woman's pain, a testament to her divine lineage. A historical fact often overlooked is the origin of Pegasus, who was not born of a hero's victory, but of a woman's death, a detail that was later sanitized and reimagined for the grand narratives of the gods. The psychological intrigue of this moment was the realization that Medusa's curse was not just a punishment, it was a transformation. It had been designed not to destroy her, but to turn her into a powerful living tool. The gods, in their infinite arrogance, had thought they could control her, but they had failed. Medusa's death, far from being the end of her story, was the beginning. She was not a monster to be killed, but a force of nature to be unleashed, a power that could create life and destroy gods. Her death was an act of creation, a profound and terrible paradox that would change the very nature of heroism. The head, now a tool in Perseus's hands, was not a trophy of a monster slain, but a key to a new destiny. A living, breathing testament to the gods' cruelty. It was a mirror that showed not just the world, but the dark, ugly truth of Olympus. It was a weapon of sorrow, a shield of empathy, and a key to a new, terrifying reality. But the question that remained was, what would Perseus do with this new, terrifying power, and would he be able to use it to challenge the gods themselves? The shocking truth behind Medusa's curse was revealed not in a moment of triumph, but in the quiet aftermath of her death. As Perseus held her severed head, it did not turn to stone, nor did it hiss with malevolent power. Instead, it wept. From her eyes, no longer silver, but a deep, bruised purple, fell the streams of liquid sorrow. The tears were not of a monster, but of a woman who had been a victim of a cruel, divine game. These tears, as they hit the ground, did not turn to dust or fade away. Instead, they transformed into a beautiful crimson flower, a bizarre detail that would later be known as the Gorgon's tear. A flower that was said to symbolize a curse turned into beauty, a symbol of hope born from sorrow. But the most shocking truth of all was that Medusa's curse had not just turned her into a monster. It had also, by a twist of divine irony, turned her into a powerful living artifact. Her blood, as it spilled onto the ground, did not petrify the earth, but imbued it with a strange, life-giving energy. From her neck, not a geyser of blood, but two small, perfect beings emerged. The first was Chrysaor, a giant with a golden sword, and the second was Pegasus, a beautiful winged horse. These two beings, one a warrior and the other a messenger, were not born of a monstrous union, but of a woman's pain, a testament to her divine lineage. A historical fact often overlooked is the origin of Pegasus, who was not born of a hero's victory, but of a woman's death, a detail that was later sanitized and reimagined for the grand narratives of the gods. The psychological intrigue of this moment was the realization that Medusa's curse was not just a punishment, it was a transformation. It had been designed not to destroy her, but to turn her into a powerful, living tool. The gods, in their infinite arrogance, had thought they could control her, but they had failed. Medusa's death, far from being the end of her story, was the beginning. She was not a monster to be killed, but a force of nature to be unleashed, a power that could create life and destroy gods. Her death was an act of creation, a profound and terrible paradox that would change the very nature of heroism. The head, now a tool in Perseus's hands, was not a trophy of a monster slain, but a key to a new destiny. A living, breathing testament to the gods' cruelty. It was a mirror that showed not just the world, but the dark, ugly truth of Olympus. It was a weapon of sorrow, a shield of empathy, and a key to a new, terrifying reality. But the question that remained was, what would Perseus do with this new, terrifying power, and would he be able to use it to challenge the gods themselves? The ultimate sacrifice for a new destiny was a conscious, a deliberate act, a final, heartbreaking moment that would change the course of Greek mythology. Perseus, holding Medusa's weeping head, did not return to his kingdom. Instead, he made his way to Mount Olympus, a journey that no mortal had ever dared to make. His purpose was not to seek glory or to prove his worth, but to use the living weapon in his hands to challenge the very gods who had tormented them. The head, once a symbol of a monster's terror, was now a mirror of the gods' cruelty, a tool of profound, unadulterated truth. He did not walk into Olympus as a triumphant hero, but as a silent mourner, a man burdened by a sorrow so deep it seemed to crack the very marble of the gods' halls. He stood before Zeus, the king of the gods, his face a mask of profound grief. He did not speak. He simply held up the head of Medusa, its beautiful, sorrowful face still weeping, its eyes still full of the profound sadness that had consumed her. The psychological impact of this moment was 1,000 times more powerful than any battle. The gods, who had reveled in their cruelty, were now faced with the living consequences of their actions. A bizarre detail often overlooked is the profound silence that fell over Olympus. There were no thunderbolts, no furious roars. There was only the sound of a woman's silent tears, a sound that reverberated through the halls of the gods, a sound that was more damning than any accusation. The gods, in their infinite power, had no defense against this. They could not turn her to stone. They had already done that. They could not kill her. Her death was a catalyst for new life. They could only watch as their cruel joke was used against them. Their pride broken not by force, but by a living, breathing testament to their own indifference. A historical fact often forgotten is that the myth of Medusa's curse was not the only one of its kind. There were others, forgotten heroes and forgotten monsters, whose stories were erased from history, their fates a testament to the gods' ruthless pursuit of power. Medusa's story, however, was a rare exception, a tale that was so powerful and so tragic that it could not be completely erased. It was a testament to the fact that even in death, a mortal's sorrow could be a more powerful force than a god's cruelty. But the question that remained was, how would the gods react to this defiance? And what would be the final terrible consequence of Perseus's act? A final message was left in stone, a permanent, terrifying warning to the gods and to all who would listen. Perseus, after his silent, devastating confrontation with Zeus, did not ask for a cure to his own curse. He did not ask for a reward or for glory. He simply turned Medusa's head to stone, her last living tears solidifying into a beautiful, crimson monument. The act was not one of murder, but of reverence, a final, conscious choice to preserve her suffering, her sacrifice, and her defiance. The stone monument was not just a statue. It was a final, terrible message, a testament to the fact that the gods' cruelty could not be erased, only contained. The monument was not left on Olympus, but on a desolate, forgotten island, a place where no one would ever dare to venture. It was a place where Medusa's sorrow could be seen and felt, a place where her story would be told, not as a myth, but as a living, breathing truth. The stone monument was a beacon, a silent, terrible warning to all who would listen. It was a testament to the fact that a mortal's suffering could be a more powerful force than a god's cruelty. A bizarre detail from some obscure historical texts suggests that the statues in Medusa's temple were not just her victims, but the very gods who had orchestrated her curse. The text suggests that the final terrible act of Medusa's curse was to turn the gods who had tormented her into stone, a final, terrifying act of defiance. The monuments were not her victims. They were her captors, a detail that was later erased from the myths, a truth too terrible for mortals to comprehend. The psychological intrigue of this moment was the realization that Medusa had won. She had not only survived her curse, but she had used it to defy the gods, to prove that her sorrow was more powerful than their cruelty. Her death was not the end of her story, but the beginning. She was not a monster. She was a martyr, a living testament to the fact that even in death, a mortal could be a more powerful force than a god. But the question that remained was, what was the true legacy of this misunderstood monster, and how would her story be passed down through the ages? The legacy of a misunderstood monster was not one of fear, but of profound and terrible truth. Medusa's story was not told as a hero's victory over a monster, but as a cautionary tale of a god's cruelty, a lesson that even the most beautiful and pure of mortals could be twisted and corrupted by the whims of the gods. Her legacy was a quiet, powerful resistance to the grand narratives of Olympus. She was a symbol of all who had been wronged, all who had been silenced, all who had been forgotten. Her story was not just a myth. It was a living, breathing testament to the fact that the gods were not all powerful, that their cruelty had a cost, and that a mortal's sorrow could be a more powerful force than a god's wrath. The bizarre detail of her legacy was the fact that the legend of the Gorgon was so deeply rooted in the collective consciousness of mortals. Her story was a cautionary tale, a myth passed down through generations, not to scare children, but to remind them of the true nature of the gods. The name Medusa became a symbol not of monstrousness, but of a profound and terrible sadness, a testament to a life that had been twisted and corrupted by divine interference. A historical fact often overlooked is the sheer number of ancient temples and artifacts that depicted Medusa not as a monster, but as a beautiful, sorrowful being, a detail that was later sanitized and reimagined for the grand narratives of the gods. Medusa's legacy was a subtle, psychological resistance, a quiet defiance that would not be erased by the gods. She was a living myth, a story whose truth was so powerful that it could not be silenced. Her story was a lesson, a warning, and a profound and terrible truth. It was a testament to the fact that a monster-esque story was often more tragic and more human than a hero-esque victory. It was a story of a woman who was a victim, a martyr, and a legend. She was not a hero, but she was a powerful force, a silent, living reminder of the gods' cruelty. Her story was a final, terrible gift to humanity, a lesson that even in death, a mortal could be a more powerful force than a god. It was a testament to the fact that a myth could be a more powerful force than any weapon, a more powerful force than any god. It was a story of a woman who was a victim, a martyr, and a legend. The thunder fades to a whisper, the lightning a distant memory. The ancient mountains, once a stage for a cosmic tragedy, are now silent and still. Take a slow, deep breath and feel the solid ground beneath your feet. The story of Medusa, a story of a girl and her sorrow, a story of gods and their cruelty, is a reminder that even in the grand tapestry of myths and legends, the most powerful stories are often the most human ones. The terrifying true story of Medusa's curse is not about a monster, but about a woman who was made one, a woman whose profound sorrow was a more powerful force than a god's cruelty. Her legacy is a quiet, powerful whisper in the wind, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable suffering, there is still the capacity for defiance, for sacrifice, and for truth. Now let the ancient dust settle, let the echoes of the gods fade, and let the quiet truth of a woman's sacrifice be a reminder that a human heart, even one broken and twisted by a curse, can be a more powerful force than a god's wrath.